People have an obsession with pigeonholing individuals and movements and trying to sort of say, you belong to this, you belong to that, you're in this particular group, you're in that particular group, you're in this team, that team, and so on. I reject that. And I think on the one hand, there's that strong coercion to conform into a team, and that therefore you represent or you endorse everything in that team. As I say, I reject that. And on the other, there's a desire to see, to reduce everything to simplicity, and I don't believe there is simplicity. I remember talking to somebody about their art collection at one point, and I was we were talking about the Ministry of Sound, and I remember when the Ministry of Sound was first being developed by James Palumbo, Humphrey Waterhouse, and the others, and they asked me if I could come up with a design, and I came up with a design, and I genuinely thought, oh, I've produced the logo for Ministry of Sound. Well, of course, it was tidied up significantly. And now there are two individual people who would claim authenticity and claim ownership of that logo. There's ChemicalX, who is spectacular, who produces these amazing pictures. I've seen quite a lot of them, made out of pills. And then there's Vincent Conner, this sort of logo maker, who is just a wizard with typefaces. And you get the same sort of thing with Steve Jobs. Is Steve Jobs responsible for that blast of modernism and typography? Again, we come back to fonts. Or is it Susan Cain? It could be either. It could be both. And the ideas often get jettisoned, and a bad idea or an idea that you don't quite like is still moving towards the final process. Now, what I tossed off on the back of an envelope is in some ways irrelevant. I don't think anybody really remembers it. I remember it, but it isn't terribly important in the history of art and commerce. But in much the same way as a monk producing a calligraphic Bible, it may be the same look as the blackface, the black letter, the black letter font which is used by the Gutenberg press. What we remember is the Gutenberg press. What we don't remember particularly is the little monk locked away in a studio at the back of the monastery, laboriously creating text by hand and illustrating it. And what becomes interesting then later on is the marginalia, the whimsical drawings which dominate that monk's thoughts as they're going through the boredom of producing page after page of Bible. And I was thinking, when something is working well, you don't notice it. And that's what good art is. That's actually, in my mind, what good animation is. When I'm working on a piece of animation and suddenly the thing looks smooth, I don't notice all the drawings that I have labored over. When I notice a really good drawing, I'm afraid the reality is that I've not done the job very well. And the desire is not to see my work. The desire is to connect with the audience. And the same thing is frankly true about theatre, cinema, YouTube. If you see the way it's done, then maybe it's not done correctly. If it seems effortless, then maybe there's a lot of work in it. I don't think I can ever claim to be effortless because I tend to do things at first take. I think if you do them at first take, they have an authenticity and they have a sparkle of life. If you try to rehearse them and script them, then they fall to pieces and seem stiff. The Paul Rand approach to communication rather than the Steve Jobs, the Jamie Reed, the grunge approach to communication. In fact, it was Jamie Reed, wasn't it, who, or maybe it was somebody else, there was this amazing person who just simply decided that typography wasn't there for communication. Typography was there for decoration. And it came in with punk rock, and it came in with this recognition that a lot of copy from a reporter was boring. So why not just decorate the page with the guff, and at least then it looks lovely. In those days, there was a thing called Letraset, which I well remember. And it was lovely messing around with one font and then another font. I don't know why I'm talking about fonts so much. But that's the nuts and bolts of how you do it. In the 19th century, as advertising suddenly became king, and there was a movement towards very simple lettering without all the squiggles, without the serifs. William Carlson IV produces block lettering, which would be readable from a distance, from quite a distance. At the same time as that was occurring, people recognized that they could use this cursive lettering at the same time and have sort of 3 or 4 different font styles on the same poster. So instead of using an illustration, they could use a variety of fonts. And it wasn't until the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s that people realized you could put a variety of fonts into the same word. It would become a bit punk rockish, like God Save the Queen, if you remember the punk rock stuff and the record labels and the record sleeves. But and this idea that sort of inspired by these sort of blackmail letters. It's whimsical. Lettering and communication can become whimsical. And you know you've succeeded when the communication, whether that is the joy of seeing something or the impact of the information, not necessarily what you're reading, is the memorable thing. When you have a message, when that message comes through, because going all the way back to the beginning of the alphabets and the move from cuneiform to hieroglyphics to the Phoenician experiment and the development of the Greek alphabet, and then the Trajans script, the Latin alphabet, and the development of serifs. All of this was about finding a way to communicate clearly. Not necessarily to communicate every word, but to communicate the idea that the Roman script was about authority. It wasn't necessarily about lots of information unless you stopped and read it. And the Greek stuff, sometimes it would go one way, sometimes it would go the other way. They didn't care. That mass of letters simply said literacy. They simply said, this is something to admire. And I think that's there in those punk rock record sleeves. It's certainly there in the Beatles record sleeves, which is a little bit earlier. And it's there in all those efforts to try and clarify communication, like the Bauhaus stuff. And indeed, even on the pages of the Times, the Stanley Morrison's experiment to produce a perfect version of a clear Latin script, which then becomes Times New Roman. And when we open the computer and we suddenly access all these all these fonts, and we download many more from internet sites, and we have this sort of multiplicity of form, it's all about trying to find a message. Now, that message may, some people would say, oh, you want to have a legible font, you want to be able to read it. Well, not necessarily. You want to create a message, and you don't want your backstory or your words to get in the way of your message. I personally love typography. I love words. I love words on a page. I don't always read the page, I must confess. And recently I've discovered Audible, and it's much easier to just sort of blank and listen to the page. But I love to actually see that text on the page. I think it goes back to Disney, and I'm afraid one of the early films that I remember seeing was Winnie the Pooh and the Honey Tree, which I have a feeling was the companion piece to Mary Poppins, and I have this memory of the letters moving around the screen, and I've looked at it more recently, and they do, and the typography becomes part of the story, and it's beautiful, and I have a feeling that that's where my joy of lettering and that form of communication comes from. I don't think it's got anything to do with calligraphy, which I was never terribly good at. I always admired it. I would never have been a very good calligraphic monk. But I am good at sketching ideas, I think. And that takes me full circle back round to this whole Ministry of Sound on the back of an envelope, and I don't know whether it was of any use. In my mind, it was definitive, but clearly not completely. And ChemicalX, I think, has to take real credit, or Vincent Conner, and I'm not sure which one of those two is more important, or are they the same person? I'm not really very sure, but maybe you have more knowledge than I do. And anyway, maybe I'm just pottering around and reading backwards and forwards. You know, there's a word for that. Boustrephedon. The ox ploughs backwards and forwards. And the Greeks wrote one way, and then they turned around and wrote the other way. And there are people who criticize me on YouTube for not always having a very clear or cogent argument, because I don't. I think in little circles, and eventually the circles hit, but not always. And similarly, my spelling and my typography can often be creative rather than disciplined. So I think the other day I was talking about an NHS trust. Of course it's an NHS trust, because the acronym NHS, when you speak it, begins with a vowel. When you write it down, it begins with a consonant. But I speak it. So the correct article for a word beginning with a vowel is an, not a.